In this video, we are going to show you how to replace your engine knock sensor. Let's get started. Let's start off by getting under the hood. You want to locate the battery located on the passenger side of the vehicle. Let's continue following it back towards the firewall. That's heading back towards the passenger compartment. You're going to find a square plastic box. We'll carefully grab the cover off of that. If you were to feel along each side of it, there's a little squeeze tab. You can squeeze it, and then you should be able to lift this up and out. Once you have the fuse panel legend out of there, you're going to want to pay attention to the fuses. What you're looking for is a fuse that says fuel pump. Looking at the legend right here, I can see that there's a 15 amp fuel pump fuse located right here. Now to use this as a legend for the fuse box, you want to pay attention to this area. It says front, it has an arrow. So what we want to do is hold it in this orientation, find where it says fuel pump, look at the fuse, it says 15 amp, and then find it in the fuse panel right back there. Now let's get inside this area with some long nose pliers. We're going to be looking for our blue 15 amp fuse. The fuse that you want to grab is the blue 15 amp fuse that's right next to that red one that's in a row of 3. We'll carefully grab onto it and pull it right out of there. Once you have your fuse out of the fuse box, just give it a quick inspection. Make sure it doesn't look like it's broken, worn, or damaged in any way. Assuming it looks good, set it on your battery. Now we can continue releasing the fuel pressure. This is going to be easy. Just go ahead and hop inside the passenger compartment and attempt to start the vehicle. You might find that it starts and then dies out, or you might find that it doesn't start at all. If that's the case, that's a good sign. That means you have no fuel pressure in the system. Now that we know there's no pressure in the fuel system, we can continue by reinstalling our 15 amp fuse. When you do this, make sure you put it in the exact same position as you had removed it. Now we can put on our plastic cover. Double check to make sure it's completely secure. You do not want any moisture or debris making its way into your fuse compartment. The next thing we're going to do is move along to our negative battery terminal. We'll use a 10mm to loosen our mounting nut. Once you've got that loose, set it aside so it makes no contact with the battery terminal. Now we're going to start disassembling the top of the engine. Let's start with the top engine cover. We can remove that by removing our 2 10mm headed bolts that hold it in place. Now that we have the front broken free, you're going to want to come along each side of the engine cover, pretty close to the rear. We're going to grab onto this and gently lift it up to break it free from the intake. Next, we're going to continue on by starting to remove some of our air intake. Let's make our way right over here to our breather hoses. We're going to remove the pair. To do that, squeeze the clamp, slide it up the hose, remove the hose from the air inlet tube. If it doesn't feel as though the hose wants to come off, you can try using a small pick and carefully get in between this area to try to break it free. Be extremely careful not to damage your hose in any way. Sometimes when you're pulling it off, it feels as though it gets a little stuck. You can also gently pry at it. Once you have your hose off of there, you want to give it a quick inspection. Make sure it's still soft and pliable and it's not torn, worn, or damaged in any way. Assuming it looks good, set it aside and do the exact same thing for the other hose. Now let's move away from those hoses and make our way down to the mass airflow sensor. We're going to have to disconnect that. That can easily be done by squeezing on this tab and then pulling the wiring off. Once you have it off, just give it a quick inspection. If you see any funny colors, that would be corrosion and that would need to be dealt with. Now we need to dislodge the wiring from the air filter housing. Looking at the forward side of this area, you're going to find that there's two little squeeze tabs and you should be able to remove this from the area. Now let's continue on to the air filter housing. You're going to find two locking clamps. Go ahead and pop those free. Once you have them broken free, continue on by lifting up the upper housing from the lower housing. At this point, I always remove my air filter, give it a quick inspection. If it needs to be replaced, now's a perfect time. Go ahead and set that aside. Now let's follow this air inlet all the way down to the throttle body on the engine. To remove the air intake from your throttle body, come right to the clamp right here. You can either use an 8mm or flathead screwdriver. You only want to loosen this enough that you can remove the tube from the throttle body. Now we can remove all this and set it aside. With that out of the way, we have clear access to our throttle body wiring harness. We're going to make our way right down here and squeeze on the tab that's right where my thumb is. When you squeeze on that, you should be able to pull this right off. Quick inspection for corrosion. Set it aside. Now at this point, what we're going to want to do is make sure we clean off any of the debris that's located around the intake here. It's possible you're going to find some along the top and down along the bottom where it connects onto the engine. We're going to be removing this, and you don't want any dirt or debris to make its way down into the engine. Speaking of that, you also want to make sure while we're doing this, no dirt or debris makes its way into this area. Go ahead and cover it with something, such as possibly a glove. Make sure it's nice and snug. Once you have it cleaned down, we're going to continue on to removing the throttle body from the intake. To do that, we're going to remove all 4 of our 5mm Allen-headed bolts. Leave that in there nice and loose for now. That's what our hardware looks like. Give it a quick inspection, make sure it's still reusable. Now we can carefully grab onto our last bolt and remove it. While we're doing that, we're going to be holding on to the throttle body. We're going to break it free from the intake, that's this plastic area, and then carefully pull it down towards the passenger side. It does still have 2 coolant hoses attached to the bottom. Be careful not to damage them. Now that we set the throttle body aside, we need to pay attention to this area here. This is a clear hole into the intake, which leads into the engine. Once again, you want to make sure no dirt or debris make its way into the engine, so we need to block this port with something. Continue on with my rubber glove and put it over. To continue removing the intake from the area, we're going to start on the passenger side. You're going to find that you have a vent tube that leads up to this area. Squeeze the clamp, slide it down, take the hose off, give it a quick inspection, set it aside. Once you have the hose off of here, continue following the intake back to where you find the bracket that holds the transmission dipstick. Remove the 10mm headed bolt from the area. Now let's continue on under that area. You're going to find that you have a wiring harness that's attached to a bracket on the fuel rail. For the wiring harness, there's going to be 2 mounting points. You want to remove the mounting points from the fuel rail. There's one right out in the open in the front here, and then as you move further back, you'll find a second. We'll squeeze the tabs located closest to the intake, and then we'll carefully get in between and separate it from the bracket. This one's a little harder to get to. Continuing on the passenger side, we're going to move along to our 4 fuel injectors. For each of these, you'll find a wiring harness. To remove the wiring harness, I'll carefully use some pliers. I'm going to grab onto that tab and the back side of the harness and carefully lift it up. Quick inspection for corrosion, set it aside, and do the same to all others on the passenger side. Now let's move over to the driver's side of the intake. Remove your breather hose. Squeeze the clamp, slide it down, quick inspection. Once you have that hose out of the way, continue on to this area. We're going to squeeze this tab, remove the electrical connector, quick inspection, move along right down to this area. You're going to find where the wire's hooked into the bracket on the intake. Use a trim tool and carefully pop it off of there. Now continue following that wiring down to its next connection point. That one's a little harder to see. It's essentially on the back side of this bracket. Set that wire aside. With the wire set aside, let's look for this green cap that's on one of your evap lines. You'll notice this hose leads all the way up to this area. We're going to come down here next to the green cap and squeeze on this clamp, slide it up, remove the hose from the valve area. There we are. I've got that separated. Check the hose. Go ahead and set that aside. Let's move along to each of our fuel injector wiring harnesses on the driver's side. You know exactly what to do. Squeeze the tab, pull them off, give them a quick check for corrosion. Now we're going to move along over to where the master cylinder and brake booster is. You're going to find that you have a hose that leads from the back of the intake all the way over to the booster. Squeeze the clamp, slide it down, remove the hose, give it a quick inspection. As you're pulling this off, you might hear a little bit of a vacuum leak. That's okay. Take that hose and pull it out of its locating bracket down under here. Now we're going to swing this up, making sure that we don't tie it around the hose for the breather. We just want to bring this up and keep it with the intake because it'll come out with the intake when we remove it. Okay, we're at the point where we're getting ready to start unbolting the intake from the top of the engine. What you're going to notice is that I left the fuel hose connected to the fuel rail in this area. This is one of the last things that I like to remove during this process because when you take it apart, you could potentially have fuel fumes or some gas still in the lines. Now we can start dismounting the intake from the top of the engine. You're going to find that you have 10 bolts holding this on. The order that you remove them and install them is very important. We're going to start on the back of the driver's side of the engine. To remove this bolt, we'll use a 10mm socket. There's that bolt. Now you want to go over to the passenger side and remove the rearward bolt as well. Now we're going to continue to the forward corner on the passenger side, and then to the forward corner on the driver's side. Now we're going to continue on going around this counterclockwise. Now let's continue on back along the back corner on the driver's side. We'll remove the bolt that's just in front of that rearward bolt. Now let's do the same thing on the passenger side of the engine. Let's continue on to the second bolt from the front. Now over on the driver's side, to gain access to our second from the front bolt, it's going to be easiest if you come over and remove this hose as well. We'll squeeze the clamp and pull it off. There it is. Now let's move to the center bolt on the driver's side. Time for our last bolt in the center on the passenger side. Okay, we're at the point that we're going to open up the fuel system now. Once again, keep in mind, once this is open, you will have fuel vapors in the air and potentially some fuel. We're going to start removing this by removing the plastic cap that holds it together. Quick inspection, set that aside. Now we can remove the fuel line from the fuel rail. The tool that you're going to want to use to remove this fuel line looks like this. This is a plastic one. You can try to use a metal one, but odds are it won't fit in there properly. Just going to stick this in here. I'm going to start by pressing one side in, and then I'll twist it a little bit and press the other side in. At the same time as I'm pressing the tool towards the line, I'm also going to press the line towards the tool. Squeeze them together. Now at this point, the tool made its way inside of the line. It's pushing the tabs out, and it should be unlocked. There we are. There's those tabs that I was talking about. All right, at this point, we have nothing holding this intake down to the engine. We're going to carefully try to rock it around and separate it from the engine. While we do, you want to be extremely careful that nothing falls down in between the intake and the engine and potentially damage the internal engine. Now that we've located the starter, let's go ahead and clean up this area and close off all 8 of our ports so nothing falls in. Now the next thing that we're going to want to do is make sure that we insert a rag inside of each of the ports. You want to make sure that it's completely blocked up so no dirt or debris makes its way into the engine. You have 2 knock sensors in this area, one on the driver's side and one on the passenger side of the engine. And the process to remove one will be the same for either. Now that we've plugged all of our ports, let's continue on by removing our knock sensor. There's going to be one on either side of the engine. The process will be the exact same thing to remove them. To remove it, you're going to come right down to the wiring leading to the knock sensor. You'll find a metallic tab along the top. You can press it down and then essentially grab onto that wiring and pull it right off of there. Quick inspection for corrosion. We'll set that aside. Next, you're going to use a 12mm socket to remove the mounting nut holding the knock sensor to the engine. There it is, friends. All right, let's get ready for our installation. Now, when you install your knock sensor, you want to make sure that you have the wiring area facing down towards the belly of the engine. You don't want it facing up or even to the side. We'll put it in position, start in our mounting bolt, snug it up, and then torque it to 16 foot-pounds. Go ahead and take that wiring and put it in place. Keep in mind, the metal tab should be along the top. When you try to press this in, you'll notice you have to squeeze the metal tab in, slide the wire up, and then when it's in the popped up position, it should be locked. It looks like it popped up. I'll give it a little tug to make sure it's completely secure. Now we're going to start cleaning up the engine so we can put the intake on. Before you do that, you want to make sure you have a nice piece of sandpaper on a sanding block. We're going to take this and clean up the areas, especially where the intake gasket needs to be. You have 4 ports on each side of the engine. When you're cleaning this, try to be as careful as you can not to get anything into any of the ports. Obviously, we still have them blocked so we can clean them out when we're done, but you want to try to get as little as possible in that area. Now that we have the first side sanded down, we'll pause on that side and continue over on the other side. Now, once you have the area of the engine where the intake's going to sit sanded down, we're going to have to fully clean it. I'm going to use the vacuum one more time inside and around each of the ports on both sides of the engine. Once I've done that, I'll make sure that I use a nice clean rag with a little bit of parts cleaner on it and wipe it down. It's important to make sure you remove each one of your port protectors. Next, we'll just lightly blow a little bit of air inside each of the ports. Now the next thing we need to do is focus on the bottom of our plastic intake. When you have this turned over, you're going to find that you have 8 of these gaskets making their way around. It's a good idea to replace the gaskets. If you're not replacing them, you should at least remove them, inspect them, and make sure they are reusable. Once you have it pulled off of there, just go ahead and wipe it down. After that, give it a nice stretch. You want to make sure it's soft and pliable and it's not torn, worn, or damaged in any way. It's a good idea to inspect them all before you reinstall them, just in case the last one is torn. At that point, you might as well just replace the entire set. Now, once you have the gaskets out of here, the next thing that you would want to do is clean down the plastic area. When you do this, you want to make sure that you do not use a solvent because it will dry out and crack the plastic. We'll just use a nice clean rag and give it a wipe. Now that I've shown you how to do that, do the exact same thing to all. Now we can take that gasket and put it in place on the plastic intake. You'd want to do the same to all. Now we can bring the intake over to the engine. Before you place it on there, look inside of each of the ports leading into the engine. Make sure you did not leave anything inside of those. Assuming it looks good, let's get that intake installed. The next thing we're going to do is start installing all of our mounting bolts. First, you can insert all of them and start them in by hand. We're not going to snug any of these yet. By keeping the intake loose, it makes it so you can wobble it around, so you can line up all of the mounting bolts. All right, let's go over to the other side. Now that we have all the bolts holding the intake to the engine started in, we're going to start snugging them. The way that you snug these and eventually torque them has to be done in a specific sequence, starting from the center on the passenger side. Let's make our way over to the driver's side. Now let's make our way to the center on the driver's side. Now we can move from the center on the driver's side to the second bolt from the front. Move along to the second in the front on the passenger side. Now let's go to the second from the back on the passenger side. Now let's go to the other side of the intake, second from the back, snug that one. Now let's get the front bolt on the driver's side, and then the front bolt on the passenger side. Now let's make our way to the back passenger bolt. And now all the way over to the rear on the driver's side. Now it's time to torque all of those mounting bolts. When you torque them, you want to torque them to 71 inch-pounds and torque them in the same sequence as you had snugged them. Start from the center, make your way out. Now we'll make our way to the second from the front on the driver's side. On to the second from the front on the passenger side. Staying on the passenger side, let's make our way to the second from the rear. Move along to the second on the driver's side. Staying on the driver's side, move along to the forward bolt here, and then move along to the passenger side forward bolt. And then over to your last bolt on the driver's side rear. Now that we have the intake fully torqued down onto the engine, we can move along to our fuel line first. We'll take this, put it in place onto the fuel rail, press it in, listen for a click. Now I'll give it a nice tug. You should feel a little bit of movement, but it should not want to fall off. If it does, that means that the fuel line itself or fuel rail is damaged. Once you're sure it's locked in, continue on with its plastic safety lock. We're going to take this and put it in position just like this. Press it in. Double check that fuel line. Once you have that connected, we'll move along to connecting all 4 of our fuel injectors on the driver's side. For these, we'll start in the rear, and you want to make sure you have the locking mechanism facing down. Listen for a click. Give each one a tug as you go. Let's reconnect the hose that goes to our brake booster. It's extremely important to make sure that this is secure, otherwise you'll have an issue with your brakes. Now that we have the hose secured to the brake booster, let's also secure it to the AC line. It sits right in this plastic clip. Now let's reconnect the evap line. Connected. Now that we have that connected, let's take our fuel hose. We're going to lift it up and make sure we have the breather hose coming from our driver's side valve cover in between this area. Once you have it there, we'll continue on to its placement on the top of the intake. Now we can secure our fuel line. Move along to the wiring. Now this wire needs to connect into right here. You remember when we took it apart? You had several areas that it needs to get pressed into along the way. Let's connect it in first. Listen for a click, give it a tug. Secure it. Okay, we finished putting things together along the driver's side. It's time to move over to the passenger side. We'll start with the fuel injectors. Let's get the second one from the front. Now let's move along to the wiring harness that has the 2 clips that get pressed into the fuel rail. Start with the rear one, it's a little harder to get to. Make sure that's secure. Let's get this on here. Now let's connect the bracket for our transmission dipstick tube to the intake. Now let's move along to the front of the intake. It's time to start reconnecting the throttle body. Once you remove the protective area from this, you're going to want to clean and inspect the gasket on the throttle body. If it looks like it's torn or worn, go ahead and replace it. Once you've done that, you also want to pay attention to the throttle body. We'll take that and put it up into position on the intake. At that point, you can continue on with all 4 of your mounting bolts. You're going to start all of them in, snug them up. Once they're snug, you can torque them to 74 inch-pounds. Reconnect your throttle body electrical connector. Time to reinstall the air filter. Place it into the lower box and press it in so it's completely sealed. After that, we'll continue on with the upper clamshell with the air duct. Now, as we go to put this in, you want to pay attention along the back side. You're going to find that you have 3 tabs. And on the lower box, you'll have 3 holes. Go ahead and line them up, slide it into place. Lock it in. Now let's start resecuring the mass airflow sensor wiring. That should press right into the side of the box, and then lock it into the mass airflow sensor itself. Connect the air inlet to the throttle body. Make sure you tighten the clamp using an 8mm socket. It's important to make sure this is tight so no dirty or unmetered air makes its way into your engine. Now let's move along to our vent tubes. It's important to make sure the hose is pressed down into the intake. We'll do the same to the driver's side breather tube. Now we can put on our engine cover. Let's have a look from the backside. Looking at this, you can see that it has a couple little pitons that protrude out. And looking at the intake, you're going to find that you have the mounting holes for them to be located into. Let's put this in position and press it in. Give it a wiggle along the rear, and then continue on to the front and install your two 10mm headed mounting bolts. Okay friends, we're at the point that we can reconnect the negative battery terminal and then start up the truck. Okay friends, we've got the engine back together. At this point, you can go ahead and start up the vehicle, let it run for a little while, make sure you don't have a check engine light, and then take it for a road test. Thanks for watching.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.